It would be two simple things. One is disturb the soil as little as possible and to feed the soil life with organic matter on the surface. That's the outline of it.
So, have you been wasting your precious time digging your garden all these years? Is there a better way to work with your soil that's going to save you loads of time and get the best growing results? Well, you're about to find out in this episode of Food Matters. Welcome back to the show. I'm Mick Kelly of GIY, and in this series I'm meeting the people who are reconnecting us with real, healthy, sustainable food. They tell us why food matters to them and why it should matter to you too. Charles Dowding is best known as the no-dig guru. A horticulturist by training, Charles became interested in the links between soil and nutrition while studying at Cambridge University, and he began experimenting with the no-dig gardening method way back in the early 80s. And the results were astounding. Charles's research and hands-on gardening practice goes to the heart of soil health, nutritional density of fruit and veg, the global food system, and ultimately our own health and well-being. This conversation is packed full of food for thought and practical knowledge and advice to help you become the best version of your home grower self.
Well, it was digging. Because it came out when it did, which is 12 years ago, most people were very much still digging. And I mean, most people still are digging now, actually, to be fair. But there was much more of a belief that you had to, and so that's what I was really trying to get through and just show an alternative reality, which is true for so many things, actually. There are different ways of doing things.
Again, I don't know, is that a myth that you have to do that? But that idea that you need nice friable depth of soil for root crops to do well, or would you... Are you going to knock that one on the head of me for me as well?
Yeah. All of that's going on. We had no idea. This has only been discovered in the last 10 years. So. And then you think, well, 10 years' time, we're going to find out more. There's more things going on. It's a great field of discovery at the moment, I would say, the soil. We know less about it than we know about outer space. Food matters to me. It's linked to health, and health, just to be really clear, is not a just absence of disease. Health is a positive state where you actually feel really good and you just want to be busy and you feel alert and alive. That's food.
As you can imagine, with so much knowledge and experience, Charles has written quite a few books so that we can all benefit from his expertise. And his most recent one is called Compost, Transforming Waste into New Life. This is his 14th book, so I had to start by complimenting him on his prolific output.
Yeah, well, I have to say it was never planned. I wrote my first book, came out in 2007, and I then nagged the publishers. I said, I want to do another book specializing in salad leaves, growing salad, because that's very much my speciality. And they took a bit of persuading and said, you mean a whole book on salad leaves? And I said, yeah, it's certainly possible. And in that summer of 2007, I did a lot of trials and used that to get photographs and everything. So that was my second book. And then I noticed that not many people grow vegetables through the winter, or not enough. And I wanted to encourage that. So that was my third book. And it just rolled on from there. And I kept sort of picking out different aspects of vegetable gardening. And it's totally not that I wanted to write more books. And recently I've sort of got so many things on now, time-wise, I really need pushing. It's me that is being pushed. And Dowding Kindersley, who I work with now, they're fantastic how they support authors, I find. And so they've helped to make No Dig possible. And my compost book has just come out. And also, working with a big publisher like that has given me insight into how the process can evolve. Like when I was writing No Dig, the working title was not that at all. It was Charles Dowding's Vegetable Growing Masterclass. And just after about a year, and it wasn't far short of the book being published, I said to them, so what is the title of this book, just to confirm, is it still that? And they said, oh no, it's No Dig. So it completely changed. But they're really on it with meeting public interest and demand. So I'm happy to keep going, actually. As well as that, I bring out my annual calendar of sowing dates. So yeah, a lot of writing.
It's incredible. And I haven't had a chance to read the new one yet, but obviously I have got a copy, which I'm very pleased about. And it looks like an amazing book, and it's such an important topic. But I do want to give a nod to your Gardening Myths book, which I think of everything you've done, I think is one of my favorite things, because there's these kind of conventions that settle in with sort of accepted truths around growing and gardening that I'm very pleased to see that you completely blasted apart with that book. What was the reaction like to that? Like, I just think it was such a brilliant idea for a book.
Well, I think because it came out when I wasn't very well known, like 2012 or something like that, it didn't hit the headlines, so to speak. But it's a book that we're still selling
Yeah.
quite a few of, and people do gravitate towards it because I'd like to even rewrite it a bit actually, because it maybe republishing it would really bring them on. Because like you, I feel we need to question so many things, that we've been told, and just finding ways that are quicker and easier,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
What was your favorite myth to bust in that particular book?
Well, it was digging, because it came out when it did, which is 12 years ago. Most people were very much still digging, and I mean, most people still are digging
Yeah.
now, actually,
Yeah.
to be fair. But there was much more of a belief that you had to, and so that's what I was really trying to get through, and just show an alternative reality that, which is true for so many things, actually. There are different
Yeah.
ways of doing things.
For people that don't maybe or like are hearing that phrase no dig for the first time, do you want to just give us a quick potted tour of that subject? Because I think, although we're going to be talking primarily about compost today, obviously the two things are very much linked, I guess. If you were to do the elevator pitch for no dig, what would it be?
It would be two simple things. One is disturb the soil as little as possible, and to feed the soil life with organic matter on the surface. That's the outline of it. But then the details are like, well, what organic matter? And in our climate, I'm in Somerset, Southwest England. I'd say we're not as wet as you, but we're pretty damp, and slugs is the big problem. So that's why I use compost as my mulch, not hay or straw, for example, because those are mulches which will harbour a lot of slugs underneath them. And then the minimal disturbance bit of no dig is, it's not like a religion. I do find I need
Yeah.
to keep saying that, because people ask me on YouTube, they go, well, how do I plant a tree, with no dig? Well, you dig a hole, actually. It is allowed. And so it's don't get too enslaved by these sort of what you think might be the rules, for
Yeah.
want of a better word, but it's
Yeah.
the principle: minimal disturbance and feed the
And
soil
why
life on
is
the
that
surface.
important? Because, like, I suppose the accepted wisdom was that you head out with your spade or your fork in the winter or in the spring, you turn the soil over. I remember the lovely gardening books with those amazing graphics of, a guy doing those lovely big sort of trenches and turning the sort of
Yeah.
sod over into the trench beside it and all that. Like, why is that a bad thing?
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
you remember them too, right? They were
makes me
like,
cringe now.
that
Yeah.
was always the opening
Oh, I know
section of the
exactly what you
book.
mean. Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up on a farm, and I'd go out there with a tractor and rotavator, and it's a lovely
Yeah.
look when you've just cultivated soil, and it smells nice too. I realized I was doing a lot of harm, because any kind of cultivation, you're damaging a lot of soil life, stuff that's living there. You're knocking it around. It's not very nice for it. You're breaking up its sort of habitation, its house, if you like earthworm channels. They can survive for quite a few years, and they keep using them and reusing them. So anytime the soil's been cultivated in any way, you've broken up a lot of those channels, and they are fantastic both for drainage, so the water can run down through, and they're also very good for holding air in the soil, which is ironically one of the reasons giving for digging and cultivating is, where you've got to get air in the soil and get it all loose and fluffed up and that kind of thing. And that, I feel, has led to a misunderstanding that plant roots can't get in there unless it is soft and fluffy. Totally wrong, actually, because they better when they're firmly anchored, but you've got all that aeration in there already from the structure created by soil life. So there's every reason, when you understand those things, it's about the biology, really. It's not so much to do with chemistry or anything. It's preserving that biology, which can then help feed the plant roots, for example, through the mycorrhizal network, as we're now
Yeah.
discovering.
And is the idea then that if you put a layer of compost on top of the soil, then that the worms effectively do the job of doing the digging for you? They'll break up that organic matter, bring it down into the soil? Is that
Exactly, because
another
if you
myth?
look, the more we can copy nature, the better it goes, because nature has a process. Getting fertility into the soil, there's nowhere you see that where people are digging and incorporating organic matter. So on the surface is how all the soil organisms are programmed to work, basically. So yeah, the worms come up and they're hunting always at the surface, and they, instead of finding, say, leaves off a tree, they find compost. And uh, slightly undecomposed is actually quite good, because that's what they're used to processing. Then not always eating perfectly compost. So that's something else I like to say is, just to reassure people that your compost doesn't have to look perfect, be perfect. There can be a few
That's
lumps
great.
and what have you, and let soil life sort it
Yeah.
out.
Like you mentioned, obviously, if you need to plant a tree, you have to dig a hole. Are there other kind of exceptions in your mind to no dig? Because I'm thinking about in my own situation in the veg garden at home, I do still dig, not dig, but I turn over the soil in my carrot bed, like the root veg beds before sowing. And again, I don't know, is that a myth that you have to do that? But that idea that you need nice friable depth of soil for root crops to do well, or would you?
Uh,
Are you going to knock
yeah, I
that
do.
one on the head of me
That's a myth,
for
mate.
me as well?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Yeah. Well, what I noticed with parsnips, for example, is how if you don't disturb the soil, basically you've got a very even structure. You haven't any kind of cultivation. There's got to be a kind of cutoff point where your loosening has stopped and you're then back into
Yeah.
undisturbed soil below, and that makes a kind of capillary break, if you like. Water finds it difficult to flow down through a breakage structure like that. So actually, that's where you can get drainage
Uh-huh.
problems deeper down. And I find with the parsnips or root vegetables, carrots, they're kind of less confused. They maybe don't shoot down so quickly, but you get less forking. I would say I don't see too much of that kind of thing. And so, yeah, save yourself the task. But there is an exception, which is potatoes. So that involves some disturbance. And the same with actually getting parsnips out of the ground. There's no doubt about it. And most people say this, they go
Yeah.
down really deep. But then how do you get them out? If you're on a heavy soil, because no dig works really well on clay. And I use a spade actually, or a fork, because otherwise I
Yeah.
can't get them all out. Because the ground is
Yeah.
firm, which is not the same as compacted.
Yeah.
That's the
So
difference.
when you say there's an exception with potatoes, you mean to get them into the soil in the first place. You're not suggesting that you need to turn the soil before you plant them.
Yeah, no, it's both getting them in
Yeah.
and getting them
Okay.
out. So, like, I try and explain this on YouTube, and I did one. I was a bit silly. I said, hey, no dig potatoes. This is how you do it. And I was holding a trowel in my hand, just a hand trowel, and this American commenter said, "Oh yeah, no dig." He's being a bit sarcastic. Of course, he's doing that. The first thing is he's holding a shovel,
A small shovel.
but apparently the American word for trowel
Ah.
is shovel. Their language is so different. So I noticed that a lot on YouTube because I've got quite a few
Yeah.
followers in the States. But anyway, yeah, using a trowel just to slide, I make a kind of slit in the surface and slide the seed potato, the actual potato, down. So it's maybe 5 centimeters of compost above it. So but it's not buried at depth. And I'm doing it one by one, so I'm not pulling out a
Yeah.
trench or anything like that. But then to harvest the potatoes, that's the question I'm asking. So how, with no dig, how do you dig out your potatoes? And it's more
Yeah.
pulling than digging. So I get my hand around all the stems and pull upwards because they haven't gone down so deep. And the roots can go down, potato roots, but not the actual tubers because it is quite firm below. So we earth up with compost, if you like, So I drop a bit of compost, more compost on top, which means I effectively do use quite a bit of compost for potatoes, but while that's quite a lot, it benefits. Like I've got leeks at the moment. I'm pulling. This is October, and we've just this morning actually before this podcast, I was pulling beautiful leeks, which are second crop after potatoes. So it's already had a bountiful potato harvest. So we plant the leeks in July. Second early potatoes like Charlotte and Nicola. So yeah, you really get benefit of adding this
Is there an
compost.
exception for starting off? I guess so. In other words, if you're starting with a relatively crap soil or relatively soil that's difficult to work with, do you need to dig for
Yeah.
the first couple of years and then go no dig, or would you say start as you mean to go on?
No, I'd definitely say not. I mean, the only time that I would see any benefit in disturbing or loosening the soil would be, a new build house and you've got a building site where they've just been driving their machines on, making it all horribly sticky. That's pretty much it. Or unless there's, an obvious reason that you can see that, after rain, the water's not draining for a
Yeah.
couple of days. And if you made a hole in the soil, it's sort of blue or green and smelly. That's compacted, truly compacted soil. And then forking it, I would say, is the best remedy, some kind of loosening through a fork. But that's a one-off. I'd do that once and then compost on top, and the soil life will do the rest for you. It might take a bit of time. But normally, most soils, that's not the case. And particularly if you start off with a lot of weeds, I will say that's a great sign. That weeds are healthy. Well, they won't grow in rubbish soil. So Strong weeds tells you the soil is fertile. You just got to work out how to smother them. That's where using more compost can come in the first year of
Yeah.
no dig, say, but not
Okay,
after
so
that so
is it
much.
a like again maybe one of those great kind of gardening book myths was that you covered the soil down with something over the winter. So you're looking at maybe I think the classic ones that would always have been mentioned would be farmyard manure, seaweed and compost. Say those that sort of trifecta, and you often saw these tables in gardening books that sort of talked about the different nutrient ratios of the different ones. Is the reason that you've majored in on compost, like making your own compost at home, because that's the most accessible of the three, or do you feel it's better than the other two?
No, I wouldn't make that differentiation actually, because farmyard manure becomes compost after, say, once it's a
Yeah,
year old, maybe. Depending obviously how it's been, what the bedding is and everything. So yeah, farm manure is compost. So all of those and seaweed. I lived for a while on Iona in the Hebrides and noticed how the crofters there spread on loads of seaweed in October, and their soil looked lovely by the spring. So effectively, they're kind of doing no dig
yeah,
with seaweed. So all of that is possible. And I think what you mentioned there, the so-called nutrient tables, I think it's a bit of a red herring really, because it's so much more. It's not only about nutrients being available, it's how available to plants they are
yeah.
through the biological network. And that's the bit that until recently hasn't been given enough allowance. So you can have, I would say, a soil that's not so nutrient rich, but if it's really full of life, the plants will find
Hmm.
what they need.
And so, by the minimum disturbance side of things, it's going to improve the availability of the nutrients to the plants. Is that the idea?
That is very much it, yeah. Because so you got the mycorrhizal network, for example, which is very thin threads of filaments of fungi that you can hardly
Yeah,
see. Most of it actually you can't see. When I started gardening in 1981, I was reading books that were saying things like the mycorrhizal network does not apply to vegetables. It's only used by woody plants. And that was the official version in 1981. And now it's recognized that actually almost every plant, and the exception given now is brassicas, but I don't even agree with that actually. I think they use it. So it's like an existing root system. So all these fungal filaments in the soil, and the roots tap into them, and that gives them access to this whole network. They develop an understanding where the root says to the mycelial network, hey, we need some potassium and some water. Network say, yeah, okay, we'll get that for you in return for some food for us, because the mycelial network does not have any source of food apart from what the carbon that the roots can give it through photosynthesis. So it's a mutual feeding arrangement. This is, I understand it anyway, and it makes sense from what I see, because like what I noticed, we put in plants, they just grow so fast. And you think, how can they do that? And it is that sort of existing network that they're just linking into. There's a real
how
beauty
did
in it.
you kind of get into no dig yourself? Like it sounds from what you're saying there that you started in a more traditional sense, I suppose, as a grower.
Yeah, very much farming background, none of this. But I became vegetarian. That led me to eating a lot of vegetables. And then I thought, nutritional content, what is it? And that led me to be interested in organic growing. I joined the Soil Association in 1981 when I was 22. All my friends pulled my leg about that. That's Soil Association. What are you doing? And got interested in soil, and then established as an organic grower late 1982. But I noticed that most organic growers were really
Yeah,
overwhelmed with weeds, and so I thought there's got to be a better way, and that led me to mulching, and then the question of mulching with what, and most of the mulching in books I read was mulching with hay and straw, and so I tried that, and then it got so many slugs, so that led me to mulching with compost. So that's how I ended up where I am, if you like. But what I found lovely about on this journey is I'm always asking more questions like, how does this actually work? And it has been so nice recently that there's so much more interest in soil, and people are asking these questions like professors, it's actually being studied. How do plant roots get hold of nutrients? And there's something called rhizophagy. I don't know. Have you heard of
I've
that
I've
one, Mick?
heard of it. I don't really understand it very well, Charles.
Yeah, I mean it's really novel. It's about basically not only fungi, but it's bacteria helping plants to find food by they kind of envelop themselves in nutrients. Now, I don't know why quite, but the way it's explained, there's a guy called Professor James White in the state. He's really developed it through microscope analysis, and the plant roots kind of envelop these bacteria and manage to get the food off them, and then kind of not exactly spit them out, but let them go again, and then the bacteria go and get more food. And I think it's a similar arrangement. The plant roots are somehow
Yeah.
feeding the bacteria. But you know what a wonderful thing! All of that's going
It's
on. We had no
incredible,
idea.
isn't it?
This has only been discovered in the last 10 years. So, and then you think, well, 10 years time, we're going to find out more. There's more things going on. It's a great field of discovery at the moment. Honestly,
Yeah.
the soil.
And I think
We know less about it than we know about
exactly. And I
participation.
think people are starting to kind of appreciate maybe the importance of nutrient density. You know, this idea that carrot A might be better for you
Yeah,
than carrot B because of the soil it was grown in, which is like, again, you know, we've spoken about this to other guests on the podcast about trying to get people to appreciate the value of organic food and regeneratively grown food. I think it opens up a world of possibility, doesn't it? That we can show pound for pound this, you know, if you grow in this way, the vegetables that will come from that soil are going to be better for you. That's potentially game changing,
absolutely.
isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. I feel we do need some evidence. I mean, I find, I run this trial in my garden, so I've got two beds side by side. One I dig every December, put the compost in the trench. One is no dig, same amount of compost on top. So the only variable is digging. And I look at the plants growing in those two beds side by side. They both have the same plants. Everything's the same, but they look different. And it doesn't always show up on a camera. It's frustrating. But to me, they look more glossy. They're kind of glowing a bit and generally more healthy. And you think "Oh, that's the food I want to eat, not the one that looks a bit flat. The green is a bit more blue and not quite so shiny golden. And that's visual. But to have some measure, I just had a soil test done actually, and the no-dig bed has quite a bit more potassium, for example, about the same amount of phosphorus. It has more copper. So I think, but how that translates into the actual food is, I find it really difficult to get a good nutrient analysis of what's
Yeah.
in vegetables. But I'm not even sure that's quite the way to go because, again, it's the biology, the life, the micro, the biome, a word that we never used until recently, and now it's everywhere. And it is exciting. Nutrient density, I think, is a
Yeah.
great term.
Somebody mentioned to me like the Holy Grail being an app on your phone that you could scan vegetables in a supermarket for nutrient density. I just thought that, I don't know how far away we are from that. And as you say, does that even mean we're measuring the right thing? But it's a fascinating idea, I think, nonetheless.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was scale then. So obviously you mentioned, and I was going to mention it myself actually, the kind of experiments, and you talk about this a lot in your social media feeds, which I think is, those comparisons, side-by-side comparisons are brilliant. They're brilliant visuals. But what do you think about applying the no-dig, that concept to 10 acres of veg or 20 acres of veg, say?
Oh, yeah, this is the question. And it was kind of answered for me by Brian of Cork
Yeah,
Rooftop Farm, because I was there this summer. I think he's gone too big too fast, and I don't think he'll
yeah.
mind me saying
I
that
think he'd
because,
say that himself.
he's debating
Yeah,
it all the time. But it very much it's asking that question, isn't it? And trying to grow 17 acres of vegetables at the moment. What I would say is that the approach that I'm recommending here and advocating is a small scale approach, just to be totally clear on that. And it's ideal for gardeners because you're not counting the hours you put in to grow your food. And it's not that no dig takes more time, it's more that growing vegetables takes time. So intensive vegetables like particularly salad plants, which I do a lot of, I just can't imagine that
yeah,
scaling up. But more importantly, how would you scale up potatoes doing no dig? Because it's the economics of it that kill it, not the ecology. It works. It's no doubt about that. But it wouldn't pay you for doing because it's quite a lot of handwork. And yeah, I just can't imagine how. But the price of potatoes is set, and the price of most vegetables actually is set by massive mechanization, which brings the
yeah.
price down enormously. But it's kind of knackering the soil. So yeah, how we square those two,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I did want to ask you, say, like, trying to be a good no dig disciple of yours, I've been covering down my beds this autumn with good covering of compost and noticed like a really intense coverage of weeds on top of that. Like, and so I was kind of thinking, hold on a minute, I thought this was going to smother the weeds for me for the winter. Now, I'm assuming like weeds growing in it it's not a bad thing over the winter. The roots of the weeds will hold it all together. But like, what's gone wrong there, or has anything gone wrong?
Yeah, no, it's not gone wrong so much as. Are you talking about new germination of
Yes.
seeds that are in your compost?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. Is it from the compost or is it coming up from the soil underneath?
Well, was the soil weedy before you put
No,
the compost on? I mean, I
no, it
don't know
was
how.
clear of weeds.
It
Yeah.
was clean. Okay, well then you've just got lots of weed seeds in your compost heap.
Okay.
It's no major problem, but if you do put the compost on in the autumn, it's difficult to hoe them, isn't it, and
Yeah.
control them over winter because it's so wet. Although actually the summers are pretty wet now as well. But anyway, that's another story. But yeah, what I would do is put some kind of mulch on um, early or late winter, like February, a month before you're going to plant. And these little baby weeds, they'll only need about 2 weeks in darkness, and they'll
Okay.
die basically. That'll be a lot easier. Whether it's a sheet of black plastic that you can reuse, by the way, just or some cardboard. The only snag with using cardboard and that you leave down there, which is what you do with cardboard, you put it on and you never remove it because it's just decays in place. But it can encourage slugs
Yeah.
under the cardboard, and I would be inclined to use black plastic in your case, and then take it up about 2 weeks before you want to sow and plant, and you'll probably harvest a lot of slugs when
Yeah.
you do that. So you could say it's
Way
a
of
way of
gathering slugs as well.
and help you to
Yeah.
control them. That could be a lot easier if you've got
And
massive amount of weeds.
are you saying to cover it down now or leave it alone for the winter and cover it down for a couple of weeks in late spring?
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with your point about the roots. If they're there, leave them. They're kind of like a
Yeah.
green manure or cover crop. I wouldn't necessarily encourage it if you didn't have it. I'm very happy just to have clean compost over the winter. But if you have got it, it's a good point. But you've got to allow time before you want to sow and plant. Firstly, for them to die under a darkness cover, and secondly, to have time to take the cover off, like I say, a couple of weeks before, just so the surface can dry out a bit, and then the slugs won't
Yeah.
be too
Okay.
prevalent.
So there's a couple of things actually that conversation has opened up. And I'll come back to how to avoid maybe the weeds in the compost. We might come back to that because I
Yeah.
think that's something we want to try and avoid. But you mentioned green manures there. Like, often in gardening books, you'll see alongside the trifecta of seaweed, farmyard manure, or compost. And I accept your point, they're all compost eventually. Where do you see green manures fitting into that? I guess I would use green manures quite a bit at home. We certainly use them here in Grow HQ. And for me at home, I think it's probably I don't have enough compost to cover down all my beds. So I sow a green manure.
Huh?
How do those two things sit side by side in your mind? Or do they?
I don't feel that a green manure is equivalent to a dressing of compost unless you're growing it, say, for at least a year. Like farmers do basically when they're, doing a crop rotation and they're growing maize, grass and clover, and then ploughing that
Yeah.
up usually to grow their wheat, or whatever it might be. But in the garden, I don't feel they have so much of a place. Nothing to do with fertility. It's more about time and space. So I feel it's more efficient use of our time to concentrate our resources to compost on a smaller area and then to crop it intensively and not have a break. To grow a green manure, you're losing space, you're losing chance to grow
Mm.
some food. So, that needs to be considered. It's not a random thing that you just do. So, you want to eat your potatoes and leeks, well, you've got to have space to do it. Any listener, I would say, be careful with green manures because I think they're missold a bit. That, yeah, they're growing, they look lovely, they're easy to grow. But how are you going to get rid of
Mm.
them? That bit is not often considered. And I think there's an inbuilt assumption that they're going to be
Yeah.
dug in. And obviously, I don't want to do that. And I'm not encouraging anyone to do it either. So there is one I use, and it's a mustard. It's a brassica, white mustard, Sinapis alba, because it grows really fast. And if you sow it in, say, late September, it can be a meter high by November. And then the beauty of it is it's killed by frost. Obviously, if you're in a frost-free zone, that wouldn't work. But if you get a bit of frost, that will kill it, and then it'll just turn to a strawy surface, and you're ready to go in the spring. But also, that's good because as long as you get a frost in the early winter, it's got time to die. Because all these green manures also build up a population of slugs. So many things come back to slugs, and yeah, I don't want that. You don't want that. So you've got to consider that as well. I would just say be careful with green manures. Grow vegetables instead. There's pretty much for every month of the year, there's a
Yeah.
vegetable you can be sowing and growing. Or just recently, we've been planting garlic, and actually I scatter mustard seed on the surface, and that just gives a nice green cover while the garlic's
Ah.
not really doing anything. You put a garlic clove in the ground, and for about 2 months, you hardly see anything happening, but you can grow the mustard, and then it's killed by the frost, and then you see the garlic appearing. So you can do little
I
things.
think the bit that people get confused about, including me, I will say, with green manures is that the pitch is, well, you grow this thing that feeds the soil. And Richard, our head grower here, is always very careful to say, well, it depends. It might feed the soil, but it might not either if it's not growing for long enough, to your point, and depends what it is as well. And then Richard will say, well, you could grow Mizuna, for example, which will do the same thing as a green manure in terms of keeping roots in the soil over the winter. Not having bare soil is probably the thing we want to avoid the most. But then I'm like, well, I don't understand how, like, if you're growing Mizuna, surely that's taking nutrients from the soil as it grows, like all plants do. So that's where my understanding of the whole thing collapses into a confused mass of crap in my head.
Okay, well, I think I can help you. I can help you with that. I would say your understanding there is too based on nutrients, or not looking at the role of organic matter, just pure organic matter. So when a plant is growing, it's photosynthesizing, it's bringing energy from the sun into the soil, and that's mostly in the form of carbon or carbon-based compounds. So think of sunlight, you're getting sun energy into your soil through the Mizuna, and the Mizuna has a root network. And even though you're harvesting leaves, the roots stay there. And then a lot of the plant you don't actually eat. You don't eat all the stems and bits that you see. Only the sort of little bright green bits is what you're harvesting. So the Mizuna is actually bringing a lot of carbon and goodness into your ground, more probably than if the soil was empty. So it is a good principle, I feel, to have plants growing, whether they're vegetables or what we call green manures or whatever. The words can be misleading, but keep them growing as much as you can. And there was a phrase you used there, which you said bare soil. Because I would say with no dig, we don't ever have bare soil because it's always mulched with compost. So I would say more as empty. The surface is empty of plants. That's technically what it is. It's not that the soil is ever bare itself because it's always protected by mulch. And that's a nice piece of knowledge as well. But I'll always try and keep good that you said Mizuna. I feel salad rocket's another one that grows really well in the autumn. You just sow some rocket, and then you'll have some rocket to eat if you like it. That is. But you're also enriching your soil with the roots, because when we clear plants with no dig, we're looking to keep the roots in the soil as much as possible. So maybe cutting just below the stem level so that the roots stay there, but the bit that actually grows is removed to the compost.
That's brilliant. I love that. A quick one. Now, I know you get asked on almost every podcast these days to hit that follow or subscribe button, but they never really tell you why that's important. Simply put, if you hit the follow button, it helps us to grow the show, get more great guests, and to reach more people just like you. So it's a small gesture from you that means a huge amount to us. Thanks. Now back to the episode. That's brilliant advice, I think. And obviously then you get, as you say, you've got a nice crop of rocket or Mizuna or some sort of really interesting oriental green over the winter, which is relatively hardy as well. So the other question or point you raised about, you were asking, is my compost bringing in those weeds? That probably is a nice segue into getting a bit more detail around compost itself. Is that like a big problem? Is it something about the temperature in the compost is not high enough, or what's going on there that I'm bringing loads of weeds in from the compost?
I wouldn't call it a problem, Mick. I would say it's just a feature of your compost making, and it's very difficult. In a small garden, I would say, depending if you've got much grass mowings. Grass mowings are clippings are a fantastic way to get a heap hot. If you've got a source of grass, you should be able to generate enough heat, which is above 50 degrees, even 55 degrees centigrade. That would kill the weed seeds. And you also need enough volume. So in the winter, for example, you never get a hot heap. So because there's no grass or very little, and not enough of it. But the other one is how many weed seeds you're putting onto your heap. And as you get into no dig, I would like to think that, for most people, that the garden's getting cleaner. There's not so many weeds going to seed and flower as there used to be. You'll find over time that your compost will get fewer weed seeds in. But when you're spreading it on the surface, they're easy to pull out, or they're easy to hoe or run a rake through. Through February, I'm looking for opportunities to just tickle the surface, I call it, using a hoe or a rake. Or even if it's a very small space, you use your fingers. You just move the surface compost around a bit. On any dry day, you've got to grab that one dry day. And that way the germinating weed seeds, which are tiny, they're disturbed enough that they will die in situ. That links to a nice old-fashioned saying, which is hoe your weeds before you see them. It's like, oh, okay. You get into that mentality of looking for weeds, not waiting to be overwhelmed by them. And that takes you to a good place. That feel more empowered then, because you're in control of your weed situation. But probably the one that you described, there, Mick, was putting your compost on in the autumn, and then it's probably just raining most of the time. You can't do that, so that's where I was saying sometimes would be good to use a cover. So you need a few strategies. I would recommend anyone to get hold of a compost thermometer. They're fun to use because you get an instant reading of temperature in your heap and tells you what's going on. If it's low, that, and you've got a lot of stuff going in, that means you haven't had quite enough fresh green. What is fresh green? Well, I've mentioned grass, but it's also kitchen scraps. Everything from the kitchen I put on the heap, including lemon peel, things people say you're not meant to. Rhubarb leaves, that's all good to compost. And coffee grounds are green in composting terms. So, there's many sources of green material. Go out and scrounge some as well. Other people's waste materials is a good place to start as well. One more thing for getting more heat is insulating the sides. This is another myth. There's so many myths in compost making as well. We've always been told you have to have slatted sides to let the air into your heap. It's not right. If you think about it, if you have air coming into your compost heap, it's going to be cooling down and drying out. We don't want either of those. So I line the insides with cardboard. If I got a pallet heap, slatted sides, I pack in sheets of thick cardboard there, and that holds in the warmth, holds in the moisture. The warmth particularly, that helps to kill the weeds.
That's fascinating. So if you have, like I have at home, like say a 3-bay kind of pallet construction, not the most beautiful thing in the world, it's fair to say, but it does the job. You're saying to line the insides of each bay with cardboard, basically, a thick, like a heavy duty cardboard, I guess.
That's it. Best done in stages. You can't go right from bottom to top in one go because it'll all collapse and the wind will blow it apart. So what we do is often taking apart boxes and putting in a sort of roughly 30 centimeter layer, and you keep adding that as you go up. And really, really makes a difference. I find actually in those pallet that you mentioned, I've got a 3-bay pallet system, and it's a great size for a heap because it's big enough to get warm, but it's not so big that it'll go anaerobic or airless or smelly in the middle. And I'm finding that it turns into worm compost almost, because the worms don't arrive at first. They come in the stage where it's semi-decomposing. And so we see the worms there maybe after 3 months after starting a heap, and it's cooled down a bit, and then you see the worms come in. Then you end up with really nice compost. And I'm finding with a pallet bay where we actually fill the heap within 2 months, say we start with one heap, fill it within 2 months, maybe 3, but with that kind of time frame. And then fill the other one. You're only filling one at a time. While you're filling the other one, the first one is maturing a bit and cooling down after it heated up. And then turn that one, move it into the one next to it. 3 months from there, we have brilliant compost. It still blows me away, actually. It's one of the most satisfying things in gardening is making great compost. So you need to apply yourself to it a bit. You need to think, look after your compost heap. It's not just somewhere you chuck the waste material. It's a feature.
My kids...
And put it in the middle of
my kids are always kind of slagging me off about being a bit of a compost nerd, and I don't know massive amounts about it, the science of it, why it's working. I do feel like I've kind of got to the point where I can turn out pretty decent compost pretty quickly using that system you've mentioned. My kids, if they're helping in the garden, and it's less and less these days, Charles, as they turn to teenagers or go beyond teenagers, in fact. But when they do help, like my son emptying out, the cleaning out his hen houses, he'll come with like big mounds of straw and hen poo, which is brilliant, but he just piles it up in a big pile on the compost heap. Or my daughter, if she's like been forced to clean the garden or whatever, she'll do the same. And I'm always giving out yards to them saying, like, making compost is like making cake. You have to put the layers on carefully. And they're always like, oh, Dad, would you just shut up? Like, you're so boring. But like that is a kind of an important point, right? That you've got to be putting on those layers of brown and green relatively carefully, I guess.
Absolutely. Especially with grass, if you put more than 5 centimeters, 2 inches in any one time, it's just going to go into a soggy layer. So we'll put on a bit, a thin layer of that, and then a little bit of brown material, which could be paper or cardboard or twiggy prunings, nothing longer than about 5, 7 centimeters, 2, 3 inches. So there's a bit of discipline there as well. Like during the summer months also, when you've got a lot of green material coming in, it's a good plan to have a stockpile of brown to go with it, like tree leaves. If you're listening to this in the autumn, gather some tree leaves and keep them in a pile near where you're going to be making compost next summer, and they make a great addition to your
So they can be your
life.
brown layer. Yeah. And people, I think, get a bit confused by that because obviously separately you can obviously put leaves into, you see people making like with chicken wire, the kind of the cages to make leaf mold effectively, but that's a different thing to compost, right? I mean, it is
Well,
composting.
it
It's a
turns into
compostable
compost, I would
material,
say.
obviously, but it's not. You're not layering
Yeah,
nitrogen in there to make it into the compost that we're talking about.
no, but it's decomposing, and really that's what a compost heap is. It's breaking down in a different way. It's a fungal breakdown, which is why it's not hot. It's slow, but it turns into a really valuable material. So I would call leaf mold, for example, a compost. And if you've got a pile of wood chip, got space in your property to take delivery of a load and just leave it for 2 or 3 years, that'll turn into
Yeah.
compost as well.
Could that be used as well as your brown layer if you needed wood chip, or is that too brown?
No, 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 it's ideal. Ideal. What I do is actually I pass it through what you can get these things called standalone
Huh.
sieves. You can find them on the internet if you put a lone sieve and it basically sits at right angles to the frame. The sieve is at 45 degrees and you can dribble bits of wood chip, say, down the front of it and the big bits stay in front and the small stuff goes through. So it's sort of a relatively easy way to sieve stuff. And then I don't want big wood chip in my compost heap because they take too long to break down, but I put the smaller and ideally half decomposed
Yeah.
already. We use that as a brown a lot, and it's valuable because it's then leading on to the first stage of compost making is you've got the bacterial decay with heat, and then you've got the fungal decay, which is longer term, and both of them very good
Yeah.
for soil.
Okay. Let's take this back then to some practical tips for people just starting out, say, with this. Like, let's say you've got a standard, maybe suburban back garden. What's your ideal setup? Is it the pallet bays? Is it like you see these kind of the tumblers? Exactly, that's the word I was looking for. The big pig, I think, is one of them. What's your ideal setup?
It's related to always to the size of your gardening, and say I don't know suburban garden. I don't know how big it might be, but it could well be that a pallet bays is
Yeah.
too much because you need a lot of material to fill a pallet bay. Where I'm talking about roughly 1.1 meter each side. They are in the end, and yeah, you're not going to get a decent amount of compost out of them without really going for it a bit or having a lot of grass to mow, for example. So I would say the conical plastic bins, especially if you haven't done this before, they're cheap and very easy to install because they're just a piece of molded plastic. There's no DIY involved. And just put it on the ground. They can be on soil. They don't have to be on concrete or anything like that. I would even make a feature of it. Some people paint them. I'm joking a bit, but don't just shove your compost heap down a forgotten corner and forget about it. It needs to be something that you look after a bit. And with those, if you just keep putting in layers like I've been describing and put in brown material. So if you're putting a lot of weeds, you'll have soil on the weed roots. That's great. That's green and brown. But you can compost everything and just keep piling it in there. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised if anyone is listening who's not done that before. So these bins are 220 litres or 30 litres, 330 litres roughly.
Yeah.
Quite big.
Do you need two of them though, right? Or that idea that you kind of have to fill it and then stop. You can't keep piling stuff in on top of a heap because, it doesn't get a chance to decompose then.
Yeah, but you can do it with one. If anyone's listening who's got a really small garden, I would just get one because what you can do is when it's full, say it gets full, might not, but at some point you'll say it's full enough and you want to start a new heap. You can just lift them off. If you get a firm grip on the top, because they're fatter at the bottom, you can slide them upwards vertically and then plonk it down next to where you had it, and you've got all your compost there. And what I do in that situation is use a fork and just take off the top layer, which is not decomposed yet, put it into where you've put the same bin, but in a new place, and then you've got access to what below it is possibly ready to use as compost. So you can
and if
do
it's not ready, you just leave it for another while, freestanding effectively.
Well, or you could put it back in and it'll all get mixed up. But whatever. There's so many ways to do this. That's why you've got to have a play. You've got to try it a bit.
Okay, so then, so that's one route, right? You can get those in any garden centre very cheap, as you say.
Yeah.
If you have enough space for pallet system, you could just have one pallet bay, or you could have two pallet bays or five. It depends on how much material you have and how much compost.
The way I recommend making them is we actually knock the bottoms off the pallets. It's the frame bit that is most useful. It makes it lighter. But anyway, you wire them at the corners, just wire at top, wire at the bottom. So that's 2 wires. And so you've got 8 bits of wire basically holding your frame in place. And no post in the ground. It's just freestanding, but doesn't blow away, because it's got stuff in. And then you undo 2 wires and you can swing open one of the sides. It becomes like a door, and that's how you can get in there. They're so functional.
That's pretty straightforward, I think. And then we've talked about the layers. So again, just to reiterate that point, you're saying 5 centimeter alternate layers of green and brown. Do you want to just very quickly go through what's green and what's
Yeah.
brown for people that are just starting out, maybe a bit confused still?
If it's 5 centimeters of green, it'll be not much more than a centimeter of brown, because keep in mind always 3 parts green, roughly,
Aha.
1 part brown. So you're not putting on as much
Okay.
brown as you are green. But yeah, what is green? So green is any green leaf, including broccoli leaves, which are quite stemmy. They have a bit of brown in, which is the fiber that's in the stem. But, we don't want to get too technical. You kind of never move, You're always making approximations. Other green things include, say, lemon peel, apples. Any soft, fresh material really is a green. And then also green, you've got the coffee grounds I mentioned, fresh manure. So a fresh horse poop, any kind of animal manure, human manure that's a green. Those are the main ones. Then browns is soil, anything woody, yard sweepings, wood ash from your log burner, whatever. All of that counts as brown. But most of the brown is woody material, and it needs to be in small pieces. It's not going to decompose in your heap if you put in logs or big stuff.
Okay. Like you mentioned cardboard and newspaper earlier on, which I think is really accessible for people because most of us have, some cardboard around. As you can say, you could stack them up beside the compost heap and have them there ready to to be used when you want to add the layer. I think that's a brilliant way to think about it. When you've got your layers up to the top of, say, the pallet, which might be whatever, 1.2 meters high or something, you stop and start filling the other heap. That's the idea, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's it, basically. But there's always judgments to make, like when is it actually at the top? Because when you do this, you realize that the heap never actually gets full because, it looks full when you finish your work and then you go back the next day and it's sunk again. Make that call. Don't try and get it brimful. There'll be a point where it's sort of sinking less fast, basically. That's your end point. Then start another heap, ideally. If you're doing it as one pallet, again, you'd have to improvise. It wouldn't be straightforward, actually. I think 2 pallets was probably a practical minimum.
And then, so we were talking about air earlier on, and you were saying counterintuitively you want using the cardboard to stop air getting in. But then bringing oxygen into the heap by turning it is, I'm always amazed at how it accelerates the decomposition by turning it. What's going on there and why is that important? And how long should you wait to do it?
That's where the brown material that you're adding comes in. So, little bits of fibrous sticks, prunings, woody prunings, like hedge prunings, they hold air in the heap because they're stopping it all matting down and becoming airless, which is the term is anaerobic, and that's like swamp. And that's what we don't want in our compost heap. So that's why you need to make sure you do add enough brown material when you're making the heap. But then what you're doing, like you say, with the turning, you're just adding a fresh dose of oxygen. And that feeds bacteria, basically, and that when they multiply fast, their metabolic action, that is what creates heat. So that oxygen translates heat as long as there's enough material for it to all build up a sort of volume of heat.
So all going well, then how quickly would you expect the process to work from like starting a heap to being able to wheelbarrow out the lovely compost?
Okay, I'm going to qualify your question a little bit by saying that, you use that phrase lovely compost, and we can all resonate with that. But I've noticed that people be inclined to beat themselves up if it's not lovely, and they'll leave it then too long. So I'd say, your end result is not going to be something like you might buy in a sack in the garden centre that, is just totally even. But actually maybe a bit more dead than what you make. It's a big value in making your own compost is the wonderful microbes. So don't worry if it's not looking perfect. And I would say it's better to use it and reach that end point before it is too even, actually, because you're putting it on the surface undecomposed slightly. That's helping to feed the soil microbes and other organisms in soil, which work to do that as well. So you've got very much a living soil surface. The thing you're looking not to have is too much big lumps. That's more if you come out of a manure heap. So a manure heap is slowly turning to compost, but most heaps of manure don't have enough air in, really. So that's where they could really do with turning, like you were saying, to get the oxygen in there. If you're in that situation, you have a heap of manure and it's getting a bit smelly, get in there with a manure fork and sort of loosen it all up and just physically move it all. Good bit of exercise in that, but it'll really pay
Absolutely.
off.
Like there's nothing quite like turning a compost heap, I think, for making you feel like you've done a good day's work. It's that sweaty, dirty, it's
Yeah.
great. It's good stuff, isn't it?
Can I just quickly say something? Because you might have been going to ask it, but just what turning actually means. And it doesn't mean literally
Yeah.
turning over, but it just means getting in there with a fork and moving the material enough that you're getting air in and breaking up any airless lumps and mixing it all as well. And have you ever used one of these compost aerator things where it's like a corkscrew on a
No.
piece of metal? You see, it comes as an all-in-one unit, nothing can break. So I think they're really good value. You can get them online. Because it's corkscrew on the bottom end, you just turn it around. It's got a little handle. You can turn the whole thing. So that takes it down into your heap. And then that's the easy bit, actually. You've got to pull it up. So you pull. And because the corkscrew has a certain volume, in pulling it, that will bring up that volume of compost from the bottom. And so it's a mixing aeration without actually moving the whole heap. But in some form or fashion, turning means doing some kind of movement to get air in and mix it all
Yeah.
up a bit. But don't get too worried about the actual
That's
process.
interesting. So like when I talk about turning, I'm actually emptying a bay into the bay beside it. So it is literally turning it. You're bringing, the top of the heap is going to the bottom and so on. But what you're saying there is you wouldn't necessarily have to do that if you use that device. Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And it's a useful bit of knowledge if you've got
Just one
just say
bay.
one of these
Yeah.
small plastic bins. They work
Yeah.
really well in that. And it means you haven't got to take it
Yeah.
and move it
That's
around.
brilliant. I've seen some Instagram videos of people putting a length of plastic pipe down into the middle of the heap with sort of holes drilled into it. So presumably that bringing air. What?
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced by that because I don't see how the air is actually flowing through
Yeah.
those holes, when they're just surrounded by compost. But what I do it on, I've got some bays which are too big really. They're 1.8 meters square, about 6 foot square, and they get a bit anaerobic, airless in the middle. And so what I do is while we're filling the heap, I do keep a drain pipe in there. It hasn't got any holes in it. It's just a pipe to make a hole when we've finished it after 2 months putting in new material. And then I'll take that drain pipe out, and that leaves a hole in the middle of the heap. And then you see steam rising out of it, which tells you that air is going in. So that is a bit like what you're saying, getting air into the middle of the heap.
There's something very liberating about the idea that your point about it doesn't need to be perfect, crumbly black gold like the stock photography that we always see in any article
definitely.
about composting. And also the idea, I think, that's been very liberating for me is knowing that like eventually everything will compost down, like including ourselves. So like, we don't need to worry too much about that fact. It's really making good compost is really about doing it as quickly as you can, but it'll all work in the end if you give it enough time, basically. That's a very liberating thought too, I think.
Absolutely. I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on that word quick, hey, mine still, people will say mine hasn't broken down yet, maybe just give it more time. I would say though, on average, if it's really fast, I would say 6 months. But I wouldn't, I hear about these so-called Barclay 28-day compost making. I just wouldn't even try and go there. It's a lot of work. You've got to turn it a lot and, let it mature at its own speed, but you can just help it basically. Between 6 months and a year for me is the time span. Summer heaps will make more quickly and winter heaps more slowly.
I guess you want compost at different times of the year too, don't you? Because, you've got beds moving at different paces through the journey of growing food in them and stuff. So you want compost available probably pretty much all year round, but certainly there's peak periods where it's really needed, isn't there?
Late autumn, mainly because maybe you're probably harvesting quite a few things and you've suddenly got empty beds, and that, to give them the soil life some food at that point and protect the soil against winter weather's actually really good. So we're putting on a lot of compost in November and December. But like you say, then other beds, say overwinter spinach, then that bed comes free in May. We'll put some compost on there. If you're going to store compost, I would say I'd give a tip, particularly is keep the rain off it because it'll go soggy otherwise. That's when it gets smelly. It does not improve in quality when it's fully wet. So anyway, I've got a roof of corrugated iron, or you could just put some corrugated iron on top, actually, held down by stones, for example. That's quite effective.
It need to be well held down by stones because that's a pretty dangerous piece of kit if it takes off in a storm.
True.
I do want to ask you about a couple of things. Like, Jesus, I've loads of questions, but we're not going to have time for them all. One of them, though, is about composting over the winter in beds that still have veg in them. You mentioned garlic earlier on, where I think a lot of people would be sowing garlic around now. We recorded this in October. Like, would you
Yeah.
compost into the rows between the garlic, or mulch rather?
I actually put the compost on just after we planted it, so make a hole with a dibber slot in the closed and not very
Yeah,
deep, therefore, because we're going to put an inch or so of
on top.
compost, 2.5
Okay.
centimeters on top.
And is
That
that a good
works well.
guide for how deep your compost mulch generally is?
Yeah, that's what we're putting on every year on all beds, whether we're going to grow carrots, lettuce, onions, potatoes, cabbage. It's not thinking so much about what
Yeah.
you're going to grow. It's that thing of feeding the soil life. So yeah, about 2.5, 3 centimeters. It's a hard one to measure. It looks deeper when you spread it, and then
Yeah.
it settles. So I'm talking about once it's settled a bit.
Okay. And then the other question is, and it's, I suppose, again, it's possibly a bit of a myth around the root crop vegetable. I think you just said this, that you're putting it on beds.
Yeah.
Like I think the gardening book wisdom would be, don't manure where you're going to grow your root crops because it'll create forking and so on. You want the nutrition to be a bit stingy with carrots because that's what you're trying to encourage root growth and all of that. What's your view there?
I would say that's old-fashioned knowledge. Understandings have moved on now. To say that carrots fork after you've applied or used compost or manure, for example, there's an inbuilt assumption, I feel, in that statement, which is that soil is being dug or cultivated. And it's that makes them fork, in my view, because you've then got these unequal distribution in the soil of organic matter in soil. And with no dig, you're just leaving it on top, undisturbed soil. They don't fork, I can assure you. The other nice thing is that you can do things I do every year. The way I grow my Brussels sprouts, I start with carrots. So I sow the carrots in early spring. Usually use a fleece cover that brings them on a bit more quickly. And then I don't sow my Brussels sprouts until May. Pot them on to sort of decent sized plant by about 20th of June. And then as we harvest carrots, or what we do is make enough space to pop in the Brussels sprout plant. This links to your question because traditionally it's presented that carrots are light feeders and Brussels sprouts are heavy feeders, but we're growing them in the same bed in the same year with the one original dose of compost that went on the previous winter. So it frees you up to do things that you've been told you can't do with these kinds of
brilliant. So the digging was the problem basically with the carrots, is your point.
Yeah, well, that's what I would say.
The other question on it, I suppose the elephant in the room somewhat, if I'm not mixing my mammal metaphors there, is rodents. So again, I suppose a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to start a compost heap in the garden because I don't want rats in the garden. And that's understandable. But what's your sense of that?
Yeah.
Because food in the compost heap will attract them. The heat, I would say, possibly attracts them too in a cold winter. So what can you do to prevent it? Or is it just part of the...
I would say it's part of it because, what is the problem? This might sound a bit blunt. I've had rats at different times. Funnily enough, I haven't at the moment. I think it's like there's more cats around than there used to be. So, there are solutions there in terms of encouraging rat predators. Rats are not immune to being hunted. And stoats is another one, actually. Anybody living in less wild location where there's stoats, they eat rats. I've seen that actually in the flesh. So it's not like it's a hopeless that you're going to get them and you can't do anything about it and they're going to overrun you. Because they're quite nice animals, rats, in a funny sort of way. They're quiet and they don't. I find it when I've had them, they haven't been on the rampage, so to speak. There's a worry about the disease they have in their urine, Weil's disease, but when you no dig and you put it on the surface, the sunlight breaks it down, so it's not a problem. Maybe So I think it's just allowing nature a bit more do its thing and see what happens. But I would never let it put you off having a compost heap unless you're a real rat phobia.
I'd agree. No, it does. Helps. I'd agree with that. I think we need to be a bit relaxed. They're not particularly nice to have in your garden. I don't think anybody would be delighted to welcome them in or anything. Sure. But I think you're right. It is possibly part of it. Is it fair to say that not adding waste food to the compost heap is a good plan anyway?
If you're worried about rats, then yeah. But I mean, I do actually, and I'm always saying, you can compost all that stuff, and it does break down. I put on all sorts of things, even like cat poo. I put on, and maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. But it's like, where do you draw the line? the more stuff you put on, the more active your heap's going to be, and it's going to all break down better. So I'm totally easy about putting on all bindweed roots,
Yeah.
everything like that goes in on my heaps. So does blighted material, because there's scientific reason for that. Blight spores cannot survive in soil and compost. They need living tissue to survive in. So unless you've got one moldy potato that never rots at the bottom of your heap, because that would hold the blight spores. But everything else is just decomposing, like all those tomato stems, potato leaves, and the blight. It blows in on the wind, basically. It's not going to come from your garden.
That's great. Another very liberating point, I think. Charles, we're liberating compost from the stuffiness and the worries and all of that. That's fantastic. So I have one more question for you, but before I do that, I might just say to people, do check out all of Charles's stuff on YouTube and Instagram. Your posts are fantastic. Your videos are like loads of information there, and it's a fantastic addition to your vast arsenal of knowledge that you've given growers like myself over the years. But we have a closing tradition, Charles, of asking our guests on this podcast, why does food matter to you?
Oh, why? God, how long have you got?
Well, not very long. So
it's life.
Give us the bullet points.
Life and fiber. Yeah, right. So you're asking why food matters to me. The quality of food, I guess is really what you're thinking in that question.
It's whatever your interpretation of the question is, I guess. I'm fascinated to hear the answer one way or another.
Okay. Well, food is life, or it should be. And I think it's really sad that many people now can't access true living food because it's packaged and kind of dead, and it hasn't got the microbes. That hasn't been talked about much until recently, but think of food as a living thing that's going to feed the biology of your gut. And so that's one part of food that I feel for me is really valuable. I notice the difference myself when I'm eating food from the garden mainly, which is what I do. Is probably 80% of what I eat comes from my garden. Still buying olive oil and coffee and things like that. It's enabling your body to function fully. And there's a lovely mechanisms between the gut and the brain that, you need tryptophan and bacillus vacca to help make the body make serotonin. The body can't make some of these things. Serotonin is the feel-good mood hormone. And so eating good food that has tryptophan and the bacillus vacca you get also actually just from being in the garden, but that will bring you health. So it's that thing of food matters to me because it's linked to health, and health, just to be really clear, is not just absence of disease. Health is a positive state where you actually feel really good and you just want to be busy and you feel alert and alive.
That's amazing. Food. What a brilliant answer. And then obviously that connection between all of the strands of what you've been talking about today, the link between your compost, the circularity of it, creating this living soil, not destroying the soil by digging it all the time, producing these really healthy vegetables that contribute to everything you're saying there. Yeah.
Great summary. You start building your body health in your garden.
Amazing. Charles, thanks a million for joining us. Really appreciate you giving it the time. The book is called Compost, Transforming Waste into New Life, and it's available wherever you get your books. And Charles Dowding, as I said, follow him everywhere he does stuff. He's an amazing character. Thanks, Charles, and we hope to see you in Waterford again in due course.
Cheers, mate. Well, yeah, me too. So
we'll
stay
do.
in touch.
Thanks a million. That's it for this episode of Food Matters, but we would love you to get more connected to the GOY universe. So we believe that our food system is having a catastrophic impact on people's health and the health of our planet. And we think a movement of people growing some of their own food is the way to fix it. You can stay connected to GIY by signing up to our free newsletter and check out our full range of events, campaigns, resources and courses at giy.ie. As always, I want to say that we could not do Food Matters without our amazing team. Our producer and editor is Patrick Haughey. Pre-production, guest research and booking by Caroline Hennessy. Marketing, PR and social is done by the amazing GIY marketing team of Jen Langan, Catherine Keary and Susanna Phillip. Finally, thanks to each and every one of you for listening. Do please get in touch with us if you've got any feedback. We absolutely love hearing from you. Thanks for listening and see you soon.